Russia didn't declare war, it didn't send tanks or fire missiles. Instead, it unleashed a weapon far more terrifying: economic strangulation from within. No bullets, no bombs, just silence and precision. For decades, Azerbaijan balanced between two global powers. It cooperated deeply with Russia in energy, military, and politics, while also courting Western financial and technological support. The country was seen as a model of neutrality in the volatile Caucasus region, but neutrality was no longer enough. In a quiet but seismic move, Baku began secret negotiations with NATO. The leak exploded like a bomb in Moscow's corridors of power. To the Kremlin, the Caucasus isn't just a border, it's a strategic lifeline to Central Asia and the Middle East. Azerbaijan's pivot was seen not as diplomacy, but as betrayal. The bear had been stabbed, and it woke up angry. The first blow came swiftly and silently. Russia didn't fire a single shot. Instead, it crippled Azerbaijan's economy in mere days. The Kremlin's retaliation was cold, calculated, and devastating. It began with agriculture. Russia's agricultural watchdog suddenly discovered dangerous pests in Azerbaijani produce. Within 24 hours, the northern border was sealed. Thousands of tons of pomegranates, tomatoes, and grapes, Baku's key exports, were left to rot under the scorching sun. The decaying fruit became a symbol of Moscow's silent punishment. Next came the industrial freeze. Contracts for machinery, infrastructure, and technical supplies were suspended indefinitely. Then, the gas price doubled, factories slowed down, some shut down entirely, unable to afford operations. Azerbaijan, once hailed as the Caucasus tiger for its rapid growth, now faced the specter of widespread bankruptcy. Farmers cried in their fields, traders abandoned markets. Citizens lined up at supermarkets as food prices soared. But worse than the economic collapse was the crumbling trust in the government. Inside Baku, panic spread. The first wave of sanctions shattered the calm. Smoke-filled rooms and dim-lit emergency meetings revealed a government in crisis. President Aliyev found himself caught between two opposing forces. One faction, conservative security and diplomatic officials, pushed hard for NATO, seeing it as a golden chance to escape Russia's shadow. They believed turning back now would mean losing face internationally. To them, Moscow was the past and the West was the future. But they forgot, the future hadn't arrived yet, and the past was tightening its grip. The opposing campy oligarchs, technocrats, and major business leaders saw the damage firsthand. They didn't care for political ideals, they cared about survival. In closed-door meetings, agricultural tycoons, energy magnates, and transport bosses warned Aliyev, if we keep provoking Russia, we'll burn ourselves alive. The West won't save us in time. Russia will destroy us in days. The division wasn't just within the government, it spilled into society. Social media exploded with hashtags, #SaveOurFarmers, #Return to Russia, #Lower food prices. The excitement of Western integration vanished like foam in the wind. With Azerbaijan's foundation shaking, Russia launched its second strike, psychological warfare. No bombs, no invasions, just fear. Russian military convoys appeared near the northern border, moving like silent steel serpents in the night. Artillery, armored vehicles, and S-400 air defense systems were deployed. Fighter jets roared overhead, skimming the edge of Azerbaijani airspace, a loud, proud reminder of who's watching. The Kremlin didn't need to fire. Its presence alone suffocated Baku. The government felt trapped in a sealed room, every move monitored, every decision vulnerable to instant destruction. Central Asian allies, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, quietly backed away, meetings postponed, exports halted. Investments withdrawn, silence spoke volumes. No one wanted to be caught in Moscow's wrath. But the biggest shock came from Turkey. President Erdogan, once Baku's loudest supporter, went silent. No letters, no ambassadors, no speeches. The silence was deafening. And final. Azerbaijan stood alone. Ankara chose diplomacy over confrontation. For Turkey, preserving ties with Moscow outweighed loyalty to Baku. That silence, cold and calculated, was a psychological blow. When allies turn their backs, Western promises fade like mirages in the desert. Azerbaijan now faced the full cost of betrayal, total isolation. After economic sanctions and psychological warfare, Moscow entered Phase 3, strategic suffocation. This wasn't just a clash between two nations. It was a multi-layered siege orchestrated through Russia's vast influence network. European partners reacted swiftly and coldly. Infrastructure and trade projects were suspended. Airlines like Lufthansa, Air France, and Swissair cancelled all flights to Azerbaijan, citing security concerns. Logistics firms pulled out, severing supply chains. Ports clogged, export contracts froze. Azerbaijan was being erased from the regional trade map, replaced by red warnings of political risk. But the deadliest strike came from within. International media began whispering Moscow was quietly reconnecting with Azerbaijan's opposition. Forgotten politicians resurfaced on social media, hailed as alternatives to the current regime. Pro-Russian groups grew bolder, hosting secret meetings, receiving shadowy funding. No bullets were fired, yet Baku's leadership was paralyzed with fear. Security advisors warned regime change was no longer a hypothetical. Fear seeped into every layer of power. Trust evaporated. The government began to crack from the inside. President Aliyev understood the stakes. If he continued challenging Russia, it wouldn't just be the economy that collapsed, his seat of power could vanish overnight. Not through violence, but through a silent coup. Russia didn't need war, it needed patience. Moscow's grip tightened. Azerbaijan was paralyzed, not by explosions, but by exhaustion. The collapse came quietly. Not with bombs, but with sighs of despair in middle-class apartments. Every route to the outside world was severed. Western doors slammed shut without warning. In less than a month, Baku transformed from a glowing tech finance hub into a bleak landscape of protests, hunger, and rage. Supermarkets were emptied. Gas stations overflowed with desperate queues. People no longer marched for Western ideals. They marched for rice, milk, and the fear of starvation. The dream of integration had turned into a nightmare of isolation. The slogans of freedom and independence slowly faded, replaced by a single word: survival. Inside war rooms filled with maps and emergency reports, President Ilham Aliyev faced a brutal choice. On his desk lay two paths, both soaked in blood. 1. Continue resisting, gambling on vague Western promises, and watch the nation spiral deeper into chaos. 2. Surrender, bow to the Kremlin, and trade national pride for regime survival. And then, in a bleak night where the presidential palace lights burned until dawn, the decision was made. No fireworks, no anthem, just a quiet internal memo sent through discreet diplomatic channels. Azerbaijan agreed to reconcile. It withdrew from NATO talks and bowed to Moscow. The geopolitical trap had snapped shut, and the prey could no longer escape. After weeks of economic collapse, diplomatic isolation, and internal distrust, Baku could no longer hold on. In the shadows of secret phone calls, a high-level Azerbaijani delegation was quietly sent to Moscow. No welcome ceremony, no cameras, no flags. Just a cold, heavy atmosphere inside a closed negotiation room. There, President Ilham Aliyev appeared, pale, sleepless, and defeated. Across from him sat the man once seen as the chain Azerbaijan longed to break, President Vladimir Putin, but this time, the power dynamic had shifted. No more bargaining, no more explanations. Only one action could save the regime from implosion. Aliyev bowed. He accepted every condition. NATO talks were terminated. Western troop deployments cancelled, full military and economic cooperation with Russia reinstated. No edits, no objections, no raised voices. Putin spoke only a few calm, cutting words, each one slicing through Baku's fractured pride. It was a moment of absolute victory. Not because Russia gained territory or fired a shot, but because the traitor had returned, knelt, and admitted defeat. International observers immediately called it a historic kneel, a vivid reminder that in geopolitics, freedom is an illusion without power to defend it. Azerbaijan learned the hard way. Betraying a superpower like Russia isn't just a strategic misstep, it's the fastest route to total collapse, a costly lesson for the world. Returning to Baku after the secret meeting with Putin, President Ilham Aliyev faced the press with a hollow speech. Words like economic stability and sustainable development echoed repeatedly, but no one believed them. the Western dream had officially died. Once hailed as the rising economic star of the Caucasus, Azerbaijan was now a weary shadow, crushed not only financially, but in trust, dignity, and global standing. Billboards featuring European investors were torn down. NATO flags, once proudly waved at policy forums, became awkward memories. Citizens returned to their farms and their debts after currency crashes and crop failures. Businesses that once championed Western integration now quietly renegotiated contracts with Russian partners, desperate to survive. The youth, once hopeful for scholarships, startups, and freedom, now faced a grim reality: no way out, no future abroad, no innovation, no hope. More importantly, from Tbilisi to Astana, from Bishkek to Minsk, every capital within Russia's sphere watched closely and drew the same blood-stained conclusion: no one betrays Moscow without punishment. And the haunting question lingered in the geopolitical sky: after Azerbaijan, who's next? Who will dare gamble their nation's fate for the chance to wear the NATO badge? And when the Kremlin's fury rises again, will any Western ally truly step in to take the hit? Ladies and gentlemen, look back at history and you'll see a familiar script, only the costumes have changed. In the late 19th century, European powers sat around a table, carving up China like plots of land. No grand wars were needed. Just a few unequal treaties, a few ports surrendered, markets opened, and sovereignty quietly erased. China became a victim of bloodless conquest. A century later, Ukraine seems to be walking the same path. No cannons, no warships, just banks, investment funds, and economic memorandums wrapped in humanitarian language. The tools are modern, the essence remains imperial. Well-dressed foreign advisors, holding no official rank, now shape national policy. They don't need to occupy, they only need to sign contracts and allocate funds. Ukraine is being dismantled piece by piece. Assets are tagged, policies are steered, and sovereignty is slipping away, no gunfire. Yet the consequences are the same: loss of control, loss of independence, and loss of the right to shape one's own future. History never repeats exactly, but its essence always returns. This time, the invasion isn't by tanks, but by treaties. The world is witnessing a new kind of conquest, one signed in boardrooms, not fought on battlefields. Ironically, one of Ukraine's key lifelines now flows from an unexpected source: Russia's frozen assets. After the Russia-Ukraine conflict erupted in 2022, the EU froze over €210 billion from Russia's central bank, mostly held in Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Today, the interest generated over €3 billion annually is fueling Ukraine's survival. Just this July, Ukraine received €1.5 billion from these profits. Another $1.2 billion followed. The money flows into the so-called European Peace Facility, a name that sounds like reconciliation, but in reality funds weapons, salaries, and keeps the government machinery alive. Ukraine is now sustained by the very assets of the nation it calls its enemy. A surreal twist, surviving on the interest of the adversary's wealth to continue the war. This move by the EU marks a new chapter in weaponizing national assets and sets a dangerous precedent. If a government is labeled an aggressor, its global assets can be seized, legalized, and used against it. This isn't aid, it's power politics, a new kind of warfare, fought with money and legal loopholes. In a bold statement from Brussels, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen declared, "There's no better use for Russia's money than building a safer world." It sounds noble, it sounds Western, but behind that sentence lies a geopolitical fuse with global reach. If a nation is labeled an aggressor, its entire portfolio of foreign currency reserves, securities, gold holdings can be frozen, seized, and redistributed like war trophies. This precedent dangerously distorts the very concept of national ownership, once the bedrock of global financial order. What's unfolding now goes far beyond temporary asset freezes. The West is moving from harvesting interest to proposing full legal appropriation of Russia's $300 billion in frozen assets to fund Ukraine's reconstruction. This isn't just milking the cow, it's claiming the farm. And once that door opens, who's next? Any country deemed a threat could become the next target in this global asset chessboard. President Vladimir Putin didn't stay silent. At the Eurasian summit, he warned, The more you sanction Russia, the more you isolate yourselves from the emerging multipolar financial system. Russia isn't alone. Behind Moscow stand strategic partners, China, India, Iran, and the BRICS alliance, all gradually shifting away from the dollar and building alternative financial frameworks. If the world begins to believe that national assets are no longer safe in Western hands, the global financial system could enter an era of unprecedented instability. Ukraine, once a war victim, is now an investment product with a price tag. In just 2 days, over 3.5 billion euros, approximately equals $4 billion, was pledged at the Ukraine Recovery Conference. It sounds miraculous, a lifeline for a war-torn nation. But dissect the fine print, and the truth emerges: this isn't charity, it's calculated investment. Most of the funds are conditional loans, not free, not altruistic, and certainly not unconditional. Behind the glossy figures lie harsh reforms, cuts to public spending, privatization of state enterprises, and opening up agriculture, minerals, and energy sectors to foreign corporations. These terms aren't designed to rebuild Ukraine for Ukrainians, they're crafted to restructure the economy for easier control, exploitation, and profit. In Rome, beneath gilded ceilings and elegant conference halls, there are no cries from homeless children, no laments from farmers who lost their land, no pain from soldiers on the front lines. Only talk of investment opportunities, strategic reconstruction packages, and supply chain optimization. Flowery language masked a brutal truth: Ukraine is being sold, piece by piece, sector by sector, to Western corporations. Ukraine is no longer a sovereign nation in need of help. It's an untapped market where land, resources, and people can generate returns. The so-called development advisors are not saviors, they are hunters entering a freshly opened forest. In the end, the victim of war becomes a strategic asset. And the people, those who should have been saved, become the foundation for someone else's empire of profit. Ladies and gentlemen, in the pragmatic world of Western corporations and financial institutions, there is no such thing as a free lunch. What's labeled as reconstruction aid for Ukraine is, in reality, a series of loans wrapped in humanitarian packaging. Beneath the surface lies a sophisticated system of control, calculated, precise, and deeply strategic. From the European Investment Bank to the Council of Europe Development Bank and bilateral funds from the US, Germany, and France, none of them came to give. They came to invest, and investment always comes with conditions, profit, and control. Italy, host of the Recovery Summit, proudly pledged over 30 million euros to preserve cultural heritage in Odessa. But behind the noble gesture lies a clear strategy. Italian construction firms will be prioritized for reconstruction contracts, from restoring historic sites to building new infrastructure. Post-war monuments won't just preserve memory, they'll become investment assets, protected by international trade law and owned by outsiders. And what happens if Ukraine fails to repay these insured loans? History has shown us the answer. From Africa to Latin America, from Greece to Central Asia, nations are forced to sell land, lease ports, surrender resource rights, even adjust foreign policy, just to survive a few more years. Ukraine is now walking that same path. The difference, this time, it's all legally signed, sealed, and announced with emotional press releases, but the essence remains unchanged. This is invasion by contract. In this new game, the West doesn't need tanks, just invoices. No artillery, just bank codes, reconstruction or dismemberment, one piece at a time. President Volodymyr Zelensky called the Ukraine Recovery Conference a historic opportunity to bring advanced technology and global capital into rebuilding the nation. It sounds inspiring, but what he didn't say, or chose to ignore, is the true cost of that opportunity. Ukraine is being mapped like an old colonial chart. Each vital sector, our energy, infrastructure, heavy industry, agriculture, is being marked and handed over to foreign financial powers. Joint ventures, once symbols of cooperation, are now entry points for corporations to infiltrate supply chains and squeeze Ukraine's autonomy. Fertile lands no longer belong to Ukrainian farmers. They'll be parceled, auctioned, and redistributed based on global capital ownership. The Rome Recovery Conference, with its glamorous facade and impassioned speeches, resembled a mega IPO, where Ukraine was listed on the global investment exchange, sliced into shares, and offered like a bankrupt company seeking strategic buyers. In this game, Ukrainians had no bargaining power, no choice of partners. They could only sign preset conditions in exchange for cash, just enough to keep the state machinery from collapsing in the coming months. While the West discussed contracts, the East was crumbling. Russian forces executed a calculated encirclement in the eastern and northeastern regions, targeting Ukraine's final defensive lines before reaching the heart of central logistics, the city of Dnipro. Strategic positions like Zeleny High and Oleksandrivka fell with minimal resistance, signaling Ukraine's inability to hold the line. Remaining forces retreated to Sinelnikov, a mid-tier defense point, now forced to become the last stand. But retreat was no longer safe. Bridges and river crossings were within range of Russian kamikaze drones and rocket artillery. Any attempt to reposition or escape was met with relentless pursuit. Footage showed Ukrainian units being decimated in small groups while trying to cross the Vya River. Russia's southeast advance formed a perfect corridor toward the outskirts of Dnipro. If they seized the vital highway connecting Dnipro to Zaporizhia, Ukraine's entire central supply and command network could be strangled. Kupiansk and Lyman, the neural hubs of Eastern coordination, were next. Analysts liken Russia's latest offensive to a scalpel slicing through Ukraine's strategic spine. If Donetsk is the heart of the Eastern Front, Kupiansk and Lyman are its nervous system. Severing them means paralyzing Ukraine's ability to defend, respond, and survive. In Kupiansk, a Russian special operations unit crossed the river under cover of kamikaze drones and precision artillery, seizing high ground north of the Sen settlement. They didn't storm major urban centers. Instead, they crept along forest edges, circling toward Sandalivka, a critical junction between the rear and the front lines. Simultaneously, in Lyman, once a fortified line since 2022, another Russian assault erupted, not to capture territory, but to sever Ukraine's logistical arteries. This region is the transit hub for dozens of Ukrainian units from Kharkiv, Izium, and Sloviansk. All rely on the Liman-Sandalivka-Kupiansk axis. If this chain breaks, northern Ukraine will be isolated, unable to coordinate reinforcements, supplies, or centralize defense. Military analysts warn, if Russia holds this deep thrust, Ukraine may be forced to abandon key zones or risk encirclement, a tactic that shattered defenses in the war's early stages. Fighting has erupted in Konstantinivka and Toretsk. Today, Russia's Ministry of Defense announced a shock: Novopavsivka and Voronivka have been liberated. This isn't just a geographic win, it's a direct strike on Ukraine's densest defensive grid in Toretsk and Kosatinka. Maps show Ukraine's once proud fan-shaped defense system is fracturing. Supply hubs and checkpoints now survive on sheer willpower, but the situation is changing fast. In Yampolivka, a buffer zone between two major cities, Russian forces have penetrated the center, forming a horseshoe-shaped siege around the Sanovo region. If reinforced from the north, this maneuver could sever supply routes to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, Ukraine's last command centers in the region. The greatest danger now, Konstantinivka and Toretsk are being split. Their tactical link, once the backbone of the western Donetsk front, is on the brink of collapse. If the split is completed, Ukrainian forces will be surrounded from both east and south. No retreat corridors, no room to reposition. Analysts say if Russia secures Yampolivka and Kalinivka, the battlefield won't be a front line anymore, just two broken territories awaiting defeat. And Ukraine, no longer a sovereign nation in this context, but a strategic asset being fought over. Ladies and gentlemen, the greatest danger isn't when a nation borrows, it's when it has nothing left to pledge. And that's exactly where Ukraine is heading. Land, resources, infrastructure, all have been collateralized. Strategic industries are gradually handed over to foreign entities. What remains to trade for aid are intangible, but vital assets: foreign policy, legislative autonomy, and geopolitical direction. Once financial dependence takes hold, the cost is no longer measured in budget figures, but in whether Ukraine can still decide who it is, what side it stands on, and how it defends its national interests. When a national budget survives on injections from Brussels, Washington, or Berlin, every domestic and foreign policy decision becomes subject to political conditions. Privatizing state enterprises isn't a choice, it's a requirement. Opening markets to Western investors isn't a proposal, it's a mandate. Whoever controls the banking system and aid flows can silently shape Ukraine's future without a single vote cast. And the most painful question looms: in a few years, will Ukraine still be a truly independent nation, or just a territory with a national name, governed by policies written abroad, serving interests that flow outward, while its people wait for the next aid package? Ukrainians need life, but they're receiving debt. When the bombs quiet down, what people long for isn't 100-page recovery plans or summit live streams. They don't need another speech about a brighter future or another handshake wrapped in press releases. They need clean water, a roof over their heads, hospitals that heal, and jobs that rebuild lives shattered by war. Instead, they're getting aid tied to debt, reforms dictated from abroad, and a bureaucracy run by foreign experts under the label of technical advisors. Policies aren't born from lived reality. They're drafted in Brussels, Washington, or New York, where no one has lost a home, a loved one, or a future like the people of Ukraine. When aid is bound by reform, when reform lacks empathy, and when promises are wrapped in cold financial language, recovery becomes a mask for control. Ukraine is repeating the tragedy of nations trapped in debt under the IMF and World Bank, where aid doesn't rescue, but binds. Where poverty isn't erased, but replaced by long-term dependency. Ukrainians deserve to live, but instead, they're being pulled into a vortex of debt they didn't create and can't escape. The Rome Conference ended with applause, bright lights, and eloquent press releases. But for Ukraine, it may mark the beginning of a legal takeover, a perfect performance with national assets as props. The actors, elected leaders playing the role of legal representatives. The audience, a global public lulled by buzzwords like sustainable development, lasting peace, and strategic cooperation. But behind the curtain, Ukraine is being sold, piece by piece, sector by sector, not by bullets, but by contracts and international law.